Hello, students. Welcome back for another audio lecture from our fashion writing course. In this one, I will be canvassing the first few pages, chapters of our book, and highlighting what's most important and relevant to us. So a lot of these things are relatively more on the general side, which means that, they apply to writing no matter what kind of writing you do, fashion writing, food writing, travel writing, whatever it is. A lot of these are basic tenets that are important as far as writing goes. However, in part one, writing in the fashion environment, it gives a little bit of an overall breakdown on fashion communication and, the different kind of ways that the different levels it can be communicated. It talks about, some basic modes of communication, words and symbols that can be presented in written, oral, and or visual form. And the arrangement that goes with that is given the term encoding. So developing your fashion message intended for the right audience, the right receiver, the right demographic is very important. It talks about the concept of noise, which is a reference to the other factors that may prove to be distractions and interfere with the reception of that message. It says that one example of noise is the numerous image and product advertisements placed before the table of contents in a fashion magazine. Pretty straightforward, pretty true. So moving on, there's a really, really great table that I'd like you guys to make sure that you spend a lot of time looking at. And it's types of written communication. It's table 1.1 on page 7. And it talks about the different forms, the personal, journalistic, promotional, scholarly, and business. And so in this class, we're going to touch on most of these. We're going to kind of veer away from, anything that's scholarly. You guys will do some papers and stuff, but we're not going to really go into any sort of book writing or publishing or broadcast media writing or anything like that too heavily, because we're going to kind of just focus on the most important fashion writing, modes that you would probably want to use. So moving ahead, it talks about writing at the primary level, which deals with raw materials and producers, the secondary level, apparel manufacturers, the retail level, consumers, and finally the auxiliary level, which is media, consultants, organizations, other. So, moving on. Most of what we'll focus on is writing at the retail level, especially when we talk about different kinds of promotions, and going a little bit more into that as far as the options for writings that you may want to do for department stores and things like that. But the auxiliary level, as far as fashion journalism goes, is important. Fashion promotion, we'll get a bit more into that in a few weeks when we talk about fashion advertising. And then again, it touches on fashion services, again mentioning that important trend forecasting group, the Doniger group. And I think that you guys might have access to some of these reports through LIM's library database. So it'd be important to check that out. Now, I'd just like to reiterate that at the end of every chapter that you guys read, there's a selection of key terms. And so if it's usually about, no more than 40 words, I would say. So whenever you finish reading a chapter, I highly recommend that you look at these key terms and you make sure that as you kind of scan them and process them, that you have already ingrained into your brain a solid definition of what they are and understanding. And it's derived directly from your reading. It gives you all the information that you need. So it's important that, you reinforce what you just read and just double check it against the key terms. All right, moving forward. We're not going to really deal too much with the case studies in the book. I feel like I'd rather have you guys work on some other applicable exercises within the book, and some that I've derived for you as well. But, if some of these industry profiles are interesting, definitely take a look at them, especially if it's a topic that you feel you might want to delve into a bit more. But other than that, we're going to kind of focus on these for the comprehension, of the subject at hand. So going into the writing process, I'll probably say this again, so forgive me, but one of my favorite quotes on writing is an Ernest Hemingway quote, in which he says, "There's really nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." So it's, kind of his wry sense of humor is at play there. But, I feel that if writing was easy and we all were, good at it, what would be the point in a way? It's a communication form that's an art, and it can be developed, and it's challenging at times, oftentimes. So don't get frustrated, especially if you have ideas that you want to communicate and your writing isn't where you like it to be yet. You'll get there. You just have to keep practicing. You have to keep practicing reading and writing, and it'll get easier, but oftentimes it will be hard. And that's just how it is. Telling you, as a person who makes a living as a writer and has been doing so for quite some time, that you get more settled in your routine, and the little things you have to check off as far as the writing process goes gets more ingrained into your brain and becomes more rhythmic. But it still has moments where it's difficult and you get stuck and you're uninspired or not motivated, and or you just feel like something that you wrote is just total garbage. And sometimes the value in that is really the realization of it. So then you can go back in and edit, and kind of edit more willfully then. So there is value in, the mistakes that you make, almost more so than the things that you do right. So let's move into the writing process in our Writing for the Fashion Business text. And so right off the bat, it gives you 6 different steps that are the 6 different stages illustrated in the writing process. Step 1 is planning. Consider the purpose, audience, and tone. Choose a topic. Discuss ideas to write about. Stage 2 is shaping. Decide how to organize the material. Step 3 is drafting. Write the first draft. Step 4 is revising. A re-see of what has been written. Write additional drafts. Step 5 is editing. Check grammar, spelling, punctuation, and mechanics. Step 6 is proofreading. Check for typographical errors. So, I know that it sounds like a lengthy process, but going through all of it, and I mean all of it, will mean that you become a much better writer. Most students I know are keen to skip steps at least 5 and 6, the editing and proofreading. And I know that you can feel like you're just done with it, you just want to move on, it's good enough, you don't care, you didn't really see anything when you gave it a quick look over. I understand that feeling, but you're never really going to have a complete feature, article, whatever it is that you're writing until you go through those steps, because editing and proofreading is so crucial. I can even tell you that, writers that have been, that have achieved quite a nice level of notoriety, that are very well known, still make mistakes, It's not like their writing is foolproof, but sometimes it's good to just, get your ideas down and then go back and fine tune them, check for copy editing type comments, do the proofreading, the editing, later on, so that it doesn't slow down your creative thought process. But regardless, it has to be done. So I'm sorry, there's really no shortcut method. You just kind of need to go through it. And so, like any paper that you write in school, or at least are supposed to, it's always good to write an outline, write the draft, enhance it, revisit it, and go back in for editing and proofreading. Because, you always want to present your best self. Your best self, in this class to me as I'm just starting to get to know you. Your best self, for a prospective employer. Because the easier you make other people's jobs, the more that they'll want to keep you around and hire you. So it's important that you always put, your best face forward and do as much as you possibly can to ensure that your piece is absolutely perfect. And even when you submit a piece and you think that it's perfect and awesome, there's always a very good chance that it still will come back from an editor with more edits that you'll need to make. And it can seem that this is kind of annoying, but it's part of the process, and they're actually doing you a service by letting you see the edits and letting you know, kind of where they differentiate and give you the opportunity to correct them yourself, because oftentimes people submit work, maybe a few months down the road it'll get published. Maybe you'll see it when it's published, maybe you won't, but the chances are is that you won't remember every little thing that may have been changed and why. And so it's really important from that perspective to, see some of the edits that need to be made on your paper. So again, I'm going to help you guys with this, but for things that you may need some extra help, I definitely recommend seeking the help of the Writing Center, because it's such an added benefit that LIM has it, and it's a free service, and most people would kill to have that kind of attention and help with their work. So I definitely recommend you guys taking advantage of it. Speaking of editing, on page 60, there is an awesome chart that has all the little proofreading marks. And so when someone edits your work, I guess I should say in the old days they would manually write on it, but it could still be the case that they mark it up with these marks, or they do it kind of like electronically. But it is important to understand what these marks stand for. When I was starting out as a writer, I didn't necessarily know what all the marks were, and I would get papers back, that I had written feature articles kind of marked up, and I'd have to make the corrections, and it looked like hieroglyphics. I had no idea what the heck it was. So it's important to understand those, and there's a few that probably will be repeated over and over again, with some of the work that you guys submit. So those ones probably you should know the symbols for, like delete, close up, delete space, insert space, begin new paragraph. That's an important one. It seems like most students don't remember when to start a new paragraph. Those are insert here. Those are important. Set in small capitals, set in capitals, set in lowercase. Those are important. Set in italic type. So in italics, if we're talking about media, it could be something like another, book or a movie or something like that. Or something that you'd set in quotes would be like a TV show, like Project Runway. So things like that. So just remember that you have this as a reference and follow back to it if you have any questions about any of those marks, or you see anything that I've marked up and you're not sure what the heck it means. So going back to the writing process, let's start at the planning stage, shall we? So writers walk a fine line in turning their audience on or off to the fashion message. What's the best way to really consider how to get into that is to create a central idea or purpose statement. So just like setting up anything that you would, like if you were writing a blog, you'd want to do the about or mission statement so that you set up a clear identity and focus. You'd want to do the same thing with the central idea or purpose statement when you're writing a piece. So the purpose statement answers two questions. Number one, why am I writing this fashion message? And number two, what do I want to accomplish with this fashion message? So You can try to be as concise as possible, with getting to the point of this. And here's a few possible options for why you may be writing a piece. So it's good to kind of have in mind what the focus of the piece is. So are you writing it to reflect, to inform, to persuade, evaluate, discover, or affirm? And so it's good to kind of, when you start to read articles, while we're taking this class, to try to give them a prescription for their purpose. So now, whenever you read a newspaper, magazine article, blog article, try to figure out which of those categories might, be the purpose for the piece. And so, with that being said, it ties directly into the audience. So what kind of audience does the author have in mind that fits into, this purpose as well? So think about who will read the message, what do the readers know about the subject, what is the relationship between the readers and the writer, and what is the reading style of the audience. So it's kind of hard to think about whenever you're starting out doing this, especially when you're putting together some article pitches for the first time. And we'll do some exercises in which you'll get to practice this and kind of designate specifically, a magazine that you'll be writing for, etc., etc. But give it a go yourself and start to kind of work on this and think about it. The next thing that we kind of go into is fitting within, the tone and the imagery of each designated publication that you're writing for, if the audience is a fit, and if you're writing to their level. So, for example, you may write a piece, let's say you're doing a piece on lipsticks. Well, you may write it differently for Teen Vogue than you would for Vogue proper. So in your mind, you might have a flash of exactly what that means or what it could be, but maybe we break it down a little bit further. Maybe if the persuasive element for a Teen Vogue article may be more overt, and for a, regular Vogue article, of the same kind of subject, it might be more subtle. So kind of thinking about the difference in what the audience may be used to who reads these publications and what they might respond to. So going back to this idea of tone, it's good to evaluate some of your favorite publications. It's probably the best place to start because you're most familiar with them, to try to figure out what kind of tone they have. So tone fits under, the writing style. And we want to figure out if it's, formal, informal, if it's romanticized language, if it's a bit more casual. Is it written, in first person, second person, third person? What is the audience used to? What is, kind of the style of the magazine? And how, when you write a piece or pitch a piece, how it fits into that. So moving on to shaping, you want to think about how to organize your thoughts in a logical manner that not only makes sense to you, but also makes sense to the readership. So again, like any sort of, paper you would do for school, you really should be doing an outline first. And that way you'll have a logical progression of jotting down all of your ideas in the most important order. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly when we get to the newspapers article. But basically, you start with your lead that gives the most important information, the who, what, where, when. And then as you kind of go through your article, the traditional method for that is to kind of decrease the importance of the information as you go on. So getting back to the outlining, you guys pretty much know how to do a basic outline, but there's 5 steps of outlining that's recommended in this book. The first one is to list your ideas. The second is to categorize these ideas. The third is to prioritize the categories. The fourth is to write a complete sentence for each category heading. And the fifth, check the outline for balance and logic. So I think that pretty much makes sense to you guys. Now let's think about it a little bit more specifically. So now when you categorize your ideas, how are you going to work through them? This book gives, I guess, 5 different organizational patterns that you can utilize whenever you're sharing your ideas in written form and bringing that, to fruition through your writing. So one way you can do it, which you're probably pretty used to with paper writing, is a compare-contrast. So you present the idea and show alternative similarities and differences. Usually you kind of toggle from paragraph to paragraph, alternating, the compare-contrast is a pretty straightforward way of doing it. Another way that you might be used to doing as far as, your papers go that you've done for school before is chronological. That's exactly as it sounds. You just arrange the ideas in the chronological time sequence in which they happened. The third is geographical spatial, and you can organize ideas by regions or areas. Unless you're doing some sort of retell analysis, this may or may not be specific to you. I would say in most scenarios probably not, but you never know. The fourth is topical functional, and so you arrange ideas by topics or functions. This can easily work for fashion. You just have to remember that you just need to make each of those topics relatively clear. So you may have a little subheader that leads into each topic of the paragraph. And then the last is the journalism pattern, which I just mentioned, and that's arranging ideas in paragraphs devoted to who, what, when, where, why, and how, getting all the important information out of the way first, and then, kind of trailing down to information that might be still, necessary and interesting, but not as crucial. Okay, so moving forward, there's plenty of more ways that you can decide to kind of correlate and outline, and shape your articles. But I think the ones that we touched on are probably the ones that may be used the most for you for this class. So the writing process talks about mind mapping, which I think is something, especially, because most of you guys are highly creative, visual people, who work conceptually or can at least comprehend things in that way, that it may be really helpful to create a mind map. So it's basically merging, the visual and the contextual in a way that makes sense to you, is kind of comfortable and comforting to do. And so in the text, it kind of shows you how to do it, where you have more of like an important central idea, and then you kind of bubble around it, with blocks or different size shapes, and correlate the ideas that way. So there's a visual component as well as a written. And so if you really like this, I find that most students do. There are online websites in which they give you like a template that you can kind of just drop your text into, and it creates a nice visual for you. So one site that does that is mindmeister.com that I've used before and students have used and seem to really like it. But you can always just, kind of draw it out and draft your own too. You don't need to use a website for it, but it just kind of, merges the virtual digital side of things nicely, I think. You don't have to draw it out. So speaking of drawing it out, I feel like you guys are hopefully still with me and I'm not drawing out the writing process too long, but I think you have to lay a strong foundation for writing, and breaking things down a little bit more thoroughly than me just saying, okay guys, just get to it, will help you find, your level of writing to be a little bit more confident about it, and also to identify where you may have deficiencies. You may learn that you really hate the drafting part of writing an article, and so you try to move through that fit quickly, and so sometimes that may show in your writing, and so now, okay, even though I don't like it, I have to spend a little extra time on it. So speaking of, let's talk about drafting. So the draft is, first draft, a early edition of a document that you're writing. And so you will edit, rewrite, and write again that piece several times. Hopefully, when you feel like it's done, read it out loud, which seems like such a straightforward, easy thing to do, but most people don't, or they feel stupid doing it. Lock yourself in a bathroom, just say, read the words out really softly under your breath. You could do it, anywhere. You can do it waiting for the train, wherever. But definitely reread it, and reading it out loud really does try to help. Sometimes whenever I'm having a writer's block, I actually will use a system like Dragon Speaking Freely, which was originally intended for people with vision impairments. It was a computer software. Now it's actually an app, and it's free. There's other apps like it that you can talk to, and it does a pretty good job of recording down what you say, and making a file of it that you can convert to a Word document or email or whatever. And I think sometimes we write the way that we speak, and we don't necessarily speak the way that we write. So it's important to make the connection between the two. And it also, once you start to speak these things out loud, what you've written, it helps you to, understand inflection and paragraph breaks, and catch little things that you might not have necessarily caught otherwise. So it's a good practice to be in if you haven't tried it already. Anyways, back to drafts. I know it's a pain. I know it's just so much better to just write it and be done with, but alas, it's not the way that it goes. So do your best to get through it. Like I mentioned before, when you're writing, you have inspiration, you have a great idea, hold on to it. Don't lose it. Write and write and write. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. And we're about to go into talking about sentences. So I mentioned this before, but I know that most students seem to write really fragmented sentences. And this chapter may seem a little boring, but it's really important that you go back and refresh on the important components of sentences, paragraphs, all these things that are relatively basic, but if you didn't totally nail them properly the first time around, chances are you're a little rusty. So just a reminder, always use complete sentences to express ideas. A complete sentence contains a subject and a verb or a verb phrase. The subject is a noun or pronoun that interacts with the verb, and the verb is a word that shows action or describes a condition. So, when you guys comprise your sentences in a fashion-related scope, what exactly does that mean? Any thoughts? So, maybe we should go back and further break it down. So, here's an example. Balenciaga, under the tutelage of Alexander Wang, was revitalized into a new contemporary take on sportswear meets couture. So that can be, a example of, making a sentence that has a simple subject and a verb in it. Please, 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 please do a refresher and read over, the writing process pages on sentence types and paragraphs and all this stuff. And again, I know it may seem basic, but it's so important just to kind of drive the point home. A good sentence places the main point near the beginning of the sentence. So that's not unlike, good journalism techniques of presenting the most important information in the beginning. And then, it further references that when you write for magazines, depending on what kind of magazine you're writing for, the publication, you can modify the sentence structure and use vivid adjectives to draw the reader into the story before addressing the main point. So magazines, in particular, at the end of the day, are all about kind of splashy headlines and sales, and they rely, heavily on visual and the written word to draw the reader in, especially when, they may only have a minute or less to capture their attention. So it's important to kind of romanticize the language and make it, engaging earlier on in the piece. And that applies to the sentence as well. And then just, for the facts of the matter, sentence length should be varied within a message, but it should average no more than 15 to 20 words. So I only point this out because I think it's a really good rule of thumb to make sure that you're hitting around that point, since it seems that, in this kind of capacity, most students tend to write really brief sentences. And, there is definitely a time and a place for that, but I think, you need to prove that you can do more than that as well. So I don't want, to read sentences that say something like, Balenciaga is a classy brand, period. What? Like, what does that even mean? Why would you say that? If you're going to say that, and you want to sophisticate the sentence a bit, make it a little more sophisticated, the place that you could go from there would be to add in a semicolon and continue on. However, we would like to use a little bit more eloquent language than Balenciaga is a classy brand going forward. But just as an example, that's obviously just a few words and it's not really adequate for a sentence overall. Moving on to talking about paragraphs. So paragraphs have two objectives: one, to state and develop the topic, and two, to maintain reader interest in the main topic. So in order to maintain interest, it's important that you don't allow your reader any time to get bored. And so give them the visual interest in the mental break of a paragraph break, so that you can move along, from idea to idea, even if it's not such a profound one, but still they know that there's a little bit of a transition there and refresher. Because, for you as a reader, if you look at an article and you just see one long paragraph, isn't it a little daunting and overwhelming to want to read that overall? I sure think so. So, the best way to kind of get through that is to make sure that you have a really solid amount of paragraph breaks, and that you add some visual interest as well within that, by way of bolding, italics, bulleted points, numbers, or other kind of formats that may help to kind of group certain information and break up, the monotony of longer paragraphs. So, the chapter goes on to speak about direct and indirect paragraphs and coherent paragraphs, making sure that you continually keep the reader interested. And so it does another refresher of the facts for you, that for paragraphs after 6 to 8 lines of type, so that doesn't mean 6 to 8 sentences, it probably means anywhere from 2 to 4 sentences. really, if we think about the words that we were just suggested to allot to each sentence, you should have a paragraph break. Also, the first and last paragraphs of most written features should be shorter than the paragraphs in the body of the feature itself. So just some rules of thumb to think about as far as the balance and the flow would go of a feature. Moving forward, let's talk about the act of revising and revisions. So it's important to do this a few times. The best way to do it is to kind of take breaks in between, which means you'll have to plan out your writing. You can't really do your writing super last minute, because then it won't really give you the allowance to, take a break and then come back to it later on that day or the next day. Because, you really do need a pair of fresh eyes to look these things over. After a while, it kind of gets monotonous and you get used to seeing the same thing. And so it's harder to pick up mistakes when your eyes kind of become used to it. I mentioned earlier thinking about inflection and how it's a good practice to, read your piece out loud to kind of understand how to place and control the inflection within your writing, and that it's a really good way to do it. And so it's important to keep in mind that not every sentence holds the same weight and importance as every other. Some are definitely more important, and you don't want to just hope that your reader picks up on that. So remember to utilize the word usage and placement in each sentence, having the more important stuff at the beginning and kind of diluting down, following through the rest of that. It is a fine line to have the right amount of content, the right length, the right amount of word use. So we talked about fragment sentences, which I definitely want you guys to stay away from. But you also want to be careful of wordiness. So, it's using too many words to get to the point, or using words that are kind of like double qualifiers. So it talks about words such as very, pretty, really, words like that aren't necessarily important, or the point is already emphasized without them. Speaking of that, be sure to avoid redundancy. Try to avoid repeating, the same word or idea multiple times. The same idea is less of an offense saying it different ways versus using the same word over and over and over again. I'm going to call out to you guys to please pay attention to your word choice, because fashion writing can get really, really monotonous. A lot of people use the same words over and over again. And as an editor, as a professor, it just shows a lack of creativity and originality when there's such a clear repetition of words. And so the main perpetrators of this are words like, fashion, fashionable, style, stylish, chic. All these words are just so overdone and overplayed. And you want to be really sure to use them exclusively, exclusive to one feature or paragraph, and try to avoid them. And plug synonyms in so that, you can use like words, and also evaluate if you really even need that word at all, despite a synonym. Because that's really the fastest way for a reader to lose interest and to downgrade your piece, is to use repetitive words over and over and over again. And especially when you're writing for online, when attention spans are even shorter and you have even less space to do it. And this is the ultimate scenario in which you want to avoid repeating words over and over again. So we'll talk a little bit more about this as time goes on. But when you are writing, I think that, if you're at your computer, internet access, it's always a good idea to have a tab open to thesaurus.com. so that you can quickly look up, other like words and substitute them in. And sometimes, like this comes later in the drafting process and the revising process, in which you may have initially written the piece and then you go back in and you plug in the synonyms. Then you don't have to worry about stopping what you're doing and going to thesaurus.com and finding synonyms for the words immediately. But maybe make a checklist that's something that you need to look over for and include before finalizing and submitting a piece. Continuing on, the chapter talks about avoiding offensive language, sexist language, and keeping your writing bias free. And so in the text it says, this means that word choice and expression are free of prejudice towards gender, sexual orientation, racial or ethnic group, disability, or age. And that you need to try to be sensitive and aware of words that might be offensive or considered, triggers for others. And sometimes, it is hard to do so, and sometimes, accidents happen, and, word bias is, not intended. But you really have to be careful of these kind of things, because especially when you have published work and you're putting it out there, it says something about you, it says something about the publication, and so you want to always make sure, that you are, saying it in an effective manner, in a way, that's open. And I mentioned this in another lecture that I talked about, but since it's in this chapter specifically, I thought it's probably not a bad idea to mention it yet again. So continuing on into editing and talking about grammar. I know this is such a dreaded word, grammar. But when you are doing writing, you have to be familiar with the different grammar mechanics. And luckily, in the back of this book and part of your reading are appendixes in which they can help you refresh on some of the basics of that. If there's time, I'll go over a little bit more with you more thoroughly. But you really need to know the basics. You need to know words that are usual triggers, like there and there, your and your, other homophones and words that are similar and can easily be mistaken one for the other, but isn't something that a spell check might necessarily pick up. Therefore, it's always good to have an extra set of eyes on your work. If you can get a relative or a friend to double check your work before you submit it, that always is tremendously helpful. Don't rely on spell check only to make sure that your pieces are correct. Part of that reason, too, is that there are certain fashion words that aren't in the dictionary or are derived from another language, like Italian or French. And so spell check might think that they're wrong, but they're actually right, or may not even pick up on them at all. So it's important to make sure that you do, your very best at copy editing, to double check these things. And also, there's a lot of, foreign names and words in fashion. So you want to really make sure that if some of them are deserving of an accent mark or umlaut or some sort of special symbol or character, that you insert that into your writing. You really need to make sure that your writing upholds the integrity of a professional piece, and that it, is as complete as it can be. So don't rely on an editor or someone else to remind you that, there's an accent mark on something, on somebody's name, a designer's name. And also with spell check, with names alone, it's not really like they're going to pick them up either. So again, don't rely on it. Rely on yourself and giving everything a good once over as your, final bet against, making sure all the corrections are made and the piece is ready for submission. Please look over Appendix A as well for punctuation. because as much as I mentioned having, more robust sentences opposed to fragments, there's nothing that actually makes that worse except for the improper use of punctuation. So you have to remember that, commas need to be used appropriately as well as semicolons. And again, doing something like reading your pieces aloud will help you figure out when and where you need to inject those things. So continuing on, moving away from the editing and into the proofreading. Proofreading is, challenging. There's no way around it. You really need to make sure that the document is as free from error as possible. And so this text recommends that you read your feature, your article, 3 more times, and each time you scan it for something different. So it recommends the first time scan it for content, organization, and style. The second time for mechanics, grammar, punctuation, capitalization. And the third time for format and layout. And I really do agree with this because I feel that just like we talked about in sentences and with the structure of features, you take care of the most important elements first, and then you go to lesser and lesser ones. Not to say that format and layout aren't important, but I bet that you'll get less points docked off for that as you would for content, organization, and style. So it's important to scan in a way that makes sense for you, but make sure that you touch on all of these elements. So a few other tips, to proofread better. I recommended reading out loud, giving yourself a rest to go back and revise some more. It says to also read your document sentence by sentence, and it says actually starting at the end. So, it's up to you if you do that. That doesn't actually work for me. I think that I need to read the whole thing through start to finish because I just feel disjointed and anxious otherwise. But, it's really up to you. And then, as far as the policies go for any school, really, that you have to be very, very careful about plagiarism. So you can't fully copy, and pass something off as your own if it's an idea, writing, or creative thought of another. You also shouldn't self-plagiarize. So especially in the context of this class, if you've written a paper for another class, you should not be trying to lightly edit it or not at all and resubmit it for this class, or vice versa. And you shouldn't do that with any of your work. If you write something on your blog, let's say, you shouldn't try to submit and package it for another publication. Also is the subject of libel, which is something that reporters have to be really careful about. It basically, can go under the realm also, of bias. And it's something that is encountered more in the online environment than others because there's just so much information being put out there in so many channels so quickly. But libel is false written or spoken statements that damage a person's reputation, subject the person to hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or injure the person's business or occupational pursuits. So this is something that runs heavily through social media. So you just have to be wary of it and try not to get involved, in anything like that. And if someone, online is attacking you or saying, things that are untrue, usually the best course of action is not to respond. The more you put yourself, the more you get published, the more you become a public figure and your work becomes public. And so there are people out there that basically just live to say negative things online. And so if they post negative comments about you or your post or anything, the best course of action is not to respond. So I hope that, with that being said, it's very difficult. but you don't want to get yourself involved in any sort of situation that can also escalate to a legal situation. So let's leave that at that. So since I have a few minutes left before I'm going to end this lesson, I want to tell you a little bit about, go over some of the grammar mechanics in the appendix, and also share a little bit more of a personal story with you guys that has to do with myself as a writer. So starting off in the grammar mechanics, one of the first things it talks about are abbreviations. Abbreviations are a shortened form of a word or phrase used in place of the whole word or phrase. But before you begin to use it, you have to remember to tell your audience, your readership, what it stands for. And so I think this is another common mistake that happens with young writers, is that you assume that your reader knows a certain amount of information. You assume that your reader is on the same plane with you when it comes to, fashion knowledge. But as it turns out, most likely they aren't. They may love fashion and be interested in it, but they look to you for inspiration, guidance, and knowledge. So they're relying on you to share, your knowledge generously with them so that they can, be, enhanced and learn more about it. So never assume that your reader, knows what you're talking about, especially when it comes to things like abbreviations. So, for example, it gives a good example of the CFDA, which in like insider industry speak, everyone knows what that is. But whenever you first reference it in a post, in a feature, you'll have to say that it's the Council of Fashion Designers of America. And then you can put, in the abbreviation CFDA, and then blah, 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 blah. And then the next time that you reference it, you can use the abbreviation of the CFDA, but you have to at first tell, your readers what the CFDA stands for. So kind of going through, it talks about the importance of capitalization in sentences, and I find that oftentimes this is done incorrectly as well, is that people don't necessarily know when to stop capitalizing things or when to start. So for example, spring summer 2016. In what instance should the S's in spring summer be capitalized? Any thoughts? Well, I will tell you. When it's part of a formal title, it should be capitalized. So for example, if it's Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week Spring Summer 2016 collections, that's part of the title of the sponsorship, that's putting on the shows, then you capitalize it. But if you're just generally referencing, the Spring Summer 2016 collections, then you do not capitalize it. So I think you need to really, the best measure is not really a hard and fast rule, if you ask me, but by reading and paying attention and seeing when things are used and how they're used is a really good measure of figuring this out. And again, the best place to look to make sure that you're getting the most accurate, correct version is in trade publications. So not to beat this over and over and over into you guys, but WWD is Women's Wear Daily. Is such an important reference, and whatever kind of grammar that they use and mechanics, it's going to be correct. So I definitely recommend using them as a great guide for that. Another thing that is indicated in this appendix that most students do wrong is numbers. When to spell out numbers. I feel like, I don't know if everyone forgot this rule or never learned it, but numbers need to pretty much be spelled out, especially in their first instance, when they are 1 through 10, as long as no larger number appears in the same sentence. So what does that really mean? Well, you should pretty much always spell out 1 through 10. And then after 10, it gets a little tricky. You could pretty much write it, as its numerical self, or if the numbers are larger than 10, you can spell them out, or you can just write them out numerically. And so what I see to generally happen is that they're written out numerically. And you can stick to that rule of thumb. The only difference really that comes into play is the style guide. So what is a style guide? It's actually quite interesting. So here goes the personal story part. When I was a writer at GQ, I had started, and it was the very first day, and I had a ton of assignments that I needed to work on and get done right away, and everything was new and fresh, and I get handed a style guide. And so when you work at a publication, there will be a style guide that probably periodically is updated, modified, and basically what it is all of the things that are standard for that magazine that takes these kind of grammar mechanics and punctuation, all the things, and they have their own style of what their preferences are and how they do things. And so if you're a writer for that particular magazine, and it's more if you're on staff there, opposed to being a freelancer, you really are expected to abide by the style guide. So it was my first day, and I knew of style guides and familiar with what they could entail. And I got handed to me basically a 200-page style guide, which I panicked and eventually, tried to memorize as much as I could of it. But most likely not everybody knows everything in the style guide, but it's a really good outline of words that are totally off limits to use in the magazine. So some magazines, like I mentioned before, that you shouldn't overuse words in your writing. Some magazines in their style guide will specifically ban words like chic because they're so overused and overpopular, that they don't want to, downgrade the magazine by using these words that kind of have become generic in a way. So it's really important that if a publication has a style guide that you're writing for, or to ask for one, or you might even want to write out your own kind of style guide. So things that you've kind of picked up on or noticed that the magazine seems to do over and over and over again on repeat are probably good things that you'd want to include in your writing or in your pitches to those magazines to try to get some work. So that's my fun personal story that I pretty much panicked when I was handed this huge style guide. But it was really interesting because I felt that I really got to know the publication on a more intimate level, than I ever would have by, understanding the ins and outs of the writing requirements for it. So continuing on, I did mention, we talked a little bit about verbs and sentence structure, punctuation, the use of exclamation mark, parentheses, all these things are in the appendix. So please make sure that you use quotation marks and all these things properly. And if you don't, you will fail. Well, I shouldn't say you will fail. You'll have many chances to get your stuff right. And the Writing Center will be a huge help to you. However, when you constantly make mistakes with the grammar mechanics, it's really going to detract from your writing. And so no matter what kind of writing you do, it's going to become a problem. And you're going to have to get these things in check if you want to be a professional working in any aspect of the fashion industry. So please nip it in the bud now while you're still in school and you're doing internships and you're learning a lot, and make sure that you get your writing on point. So, as one of the last things I want to discuss in this lesson, I talked, I believe, in the first audio file about some resources that you can use within the fashion industry to find contacts. But where do you also find, valuable, trusted sources that you can use the facts, use the information, and quote? So locating sources, it can be relatively easy to find information these days. And in the appendix, it's recommended to use search engines that are familiar to most internet users, scholarly resources that are found through searchable databases. And in addition to that, you need to think about what might also be, in the realm of that. What other, reputable sources? So obviously, newspapers are a tremendous one. They're an excellent source of information. Magazines, it can get a little hazy. And blogs, online publications, it really, really depends, and it can also get tricky. So some are more newsworthy than others. But I, don't want you guys to think that a blog can't be a credible source, because it can. You have to use proper judgment on where the line is drawn. And so sources like, BuzzFeed, or a blog that doesn't seem like it's very professional, or, hasn't been updated in years, is not going to be a valuable source. So please don't rely on them as such. Think about the kind of sources that you would feel confident using for, a final paper or something like that. And don't veer too far off into, the pop culture of, blogs and other websites that might not be a reputable source, because you may enjoy reading them on like a personal entertainment level, but as a, professional source, they really are quite dubious. So be very careful on evaluating these sources. So just to go into more specifics about that, the book actually provides a pretty nice checklist. And so I am sure that if you are looking at a source and you go through this checklist, you are going to know for sure if it's a valid source or not. And so it evaluates like levels on authority, currency, accuracy, substance, and support. And just to highlight a few, it asks you, is the site trustworthy? Is it based on a credible print source, such as an authoritative magazine or newspaper, or not? Are the author and his or her credentials clearly identified? Is the source known? Is it part of a conglomerate trusted media company, an educational institution, or research organization? Is the site free from grammar and spelling errors? So here we go again, looking at grammar and spelling errors and mistakes that can come and bite you in the butt as far as defining your credibility. It asks, are hyperlinks functional? And does the site have a credible domain? For example, .com, .org, .edu, .gov. Also, how old is the information? Is some of the information out of date? What is the date of, the published date on the web page? And does the site provide evidence for its assertions? Is the argument and use of evidence apparent and reasonable? What is the purpose overall of the site? Is the site overall fair, balanced, and objective? Does the site list sources for its information? Does the site clarify which content it's responsible for, and give credit to links created by unrelated authors or sponsors? So I think just by evaluating some of the checklist items on this list, you'll probably be able to easily identify if this is a credible source, or if you should abandon it and go back to an academic database, to the search engine, and try to find something that is. So We've gone over quite a bit in the writing process, going through, the six-step process of getting to writing your article, and from, the draft stage through actually like the shaping and planning, through drafting, revising, proofreading, to the layout, grammar, mechanics, everything. And so I hope that by this point you're pretty anxious to get into more thorough writing. And we'll pick up with that with writing for newspapers, going into writing for magazines, and followed by beauty, advertising, and PR. Thanks for listening. This is Professor DiNardo signing out.